Miami is a city that was never supposed to exist, a subtropical wilderness of swamp and limestone and salt air, turned by human ambition into one of the most recognizable skylines on Earth. Glass towers rise above Biscayne Bay. Condominiums catch the Atlantic light and throw it back across the water. It looks, from a distance, like a monument to what ambition and concrete and capital can accomplish when they are pointed at a horizon and told not to stop. But underneath those towers, something is moving. Not dramatically, not visibly, not in any way the morning commuters or the rooftop pool guests would ever notice. The ground itself is moving, and it has been moving for a long time. So why, in a city that built its identity on the promise of permanent paradise, are 35 of its skyscrapers silently, measurably, inexorably sinking? Why is nobody talking about it? And why, when the warnings were finally delivered, did the most expensive city in Florida discover it had been building its future on a foundation that was never going to hold? On June 24, 2021, at 1:22 in the morning, in the town of Surfside, Florida, a 12-story condominium building called Champlain Towers South partially collapsed. Not because of a hurricane, not because of an earthquake, not because of any force of nature that nobody could have anticipated. It collapsed because it had been rotting from the inside for at least 3 years, and a warning that documented that rot in clinical, precise, devastating detail had sat in the files of the building's management while nothing was done. 98 people died. The wrongful death settlement would reach nearly $1 billion, and the engineering report that could have prevented all of it had estimated the cost of the necessary repairs at $9 million. This is the story of how a city of 35 buildings discovered, in the worst possible way, that the most dangerous thing in Miami was not the storm season. It was the assumption that the warnings could wait. To understand why 35 buildings in Miami are sinking, you have to understand what Miami is built on. And what it is built on is not, in any conventional engineering sense, a foundation at all. The entire southern tip of Florida rests on a formation called Miami limestone. It is a carbonate rock, roughly 100,000 years old, laid down when this land was the floor of a warm, shallow sea. Over the millennia, groundwater dissolved its way through that limestone, creating a structure that geologists call karst, riddled with voids, cavities, and dissolution channels, irregular in its load-bearing capacity, inconsistent in a way that no construction document can fully predict. It is not solid ground. It is, in the language of structural engineering, variable, heterogeneous, and saturated. The proper way to build a skyscraper on karst terrain is with deep foundations, specifically engineered for the conditions at that precise location. Investigations of the subsurface, pile designs calibrated to actual bearing data, and waterproofing systems rated for permanent immersion in salt water. In Miami, the water table is not deep, and in many parts of the city, it is measured in feet, not floors, and it is rising. Sea level rise in South Florida is not a projected future threat. It is a present, measurable, ongoing process. The saline water table that exists beneath Miami today is not the water table that existed when most of these buildings were designed. The conditions have changed. The buildings have not. What researchers at Florida International University found, working with historical satellite radar data, was that Champlain Towers South had been measurably subsiding, sinking into the ground at a rate of approximately 2 millimeters per year in the late 1990s. 2 millimeters sounds like nothing, but in the world of structural engineering, where the relationship between a foundation and the structure it carries is a precise, engineered contract, persistent differential settlement is not a rounding error. It is a signal. The building was moving when it should have been still. That signal was visible from space, and nobody acted on it for 20 years. Building on Miami limestone, without a thorough geotechnical understanding of exactly what is beneath each specific footprint, is not engineering. It is a wager. And in Surfside, in the summer of 2021, the wager came due. But the geology alone did not doom these buildings. There was a second decision, a legal one, made not by engineers, but by legislators and condominium boards that ensured the rot would never be found in time. For decades in Florida, state law allowed condominium associations to hold a vote and legally waive their reserve fund obligations. Reserves are the money set aside for major structural repairs, the re-waterproofing of a pool deck, the replacement of a failed drainage membrane, the remediation of corroding rebar. They are, in structural terms, the building's maintenance budget for the problems that don't announce themselves until they announce themselves catastrophically. In October of 2018, a structural engineering firm called Morabito Consultants completed a field survey of Champlain Towers South and delivered their findings to the Condominium Association. Their report was clinical and detailed, and alarming. It identified major structural damage to the concrete slab below the pool deck. It identified cracking and spalling in the concrete columns and beams of the parking structure below the building. And it contained a sentence that would eventually be read into a court record and reprinted across the world. Failed waterproofing was the major cause of the ongoing deterioration of the concrete structural slab. The estimated cost of the necessary repairs was $9 million. A subsequent updated estimate placed the figure closer to $16 million. The association received the report, discussed it, and began the process of figuring out how to fund repairs that their reserves had not been built to cover. The building collapsed 2 years and 8 months later. This is not a theory. This is the subject of a wrongful death class action lawsuit filed in Miami-Dade Circuit Court. And the documentation from that litigation is public record. The case established that the 2018 warning existed, that the association had been made aware of it, and that the repairs had not been completed. The settlement reached in May of 2022 was approximately $997 million. Not $9 million, $1 billion. The analogy is not complicated. Imagine being handed a report by a licensed mechanic that your car's brake system is failing and will fail completely within a foreseeable time frame. Imagine reading it, filing it, and continuing to drive. That is what happened at Champlain Towers South. And what the post-Surfside inspection rounds have revealed across 35 buildings in Miami-Dade and Broward counties is that this was not an isolated failure. It was a pattern. Buildings across Miami are now receiving milestone inspection reports that read like variations on the 2018 Morabito document. Structural deficiencies, waterproofing failures, deferred maintenance measured in years or decades, and the reserve funds are not there to pay for them. The law that was supposed to prevent this was the law that allowed it to happen. And now that the law has changed, the full cost of what was deferred is coming due all at once. Even for the buildings where the engineering solution is theoretically straightforward, there is a third problem waiting, one that makes the decision to repair as mathematically irrational as it was for any building in legal and financial collapse. Consider what happens when a condominium building receives a milestone inspection report documenting millions of dollars in necessary structural repairs. The association must fund those repairs. Under Florida's new building safety law, passed in 2022, they can no longer defer them. They must issue special assessments to the unit owners. The documented range of these assessments in buildings across Miami-Dade and Broward runs from $30,000 to over $200,000 per unit. For an owner who bought on a fixed income and has no reserve of capital to draw on, a six-figure special assessment is not a bill they can pay. And when enough unit owners cannot pay, the association cannot collect enough to fund the repairs, the economic trap goes deeper than affordability. A building with a publicly documented structural deficiency, in a city where a catastrophic collapse just killed 98 people, is not worth what an identical building without that history is worth. What buyer would pay full price? What bank would write the mortgage? What insurance company would write the policy without surcharges that make ownership prohibitive? The stigma is permanent. The repaired building may be structurally sound, but it will never again be economically equivalent to a building without that history. In Surfside, after the collapse, the oceanfront land on which Champlain Towers South had stood sold for approximately $120 million. The land was worth more than the building had been. In Miami Beach, Crestview Towers, evacuated after Surfside and deemed unsafe, was demolished. The same calculation that rendered 161 Maiden Lane permanently unfixable is now being made across 35 buildings in one of the most valuable coastal real estate markets in America. So what was the terrible engineering behind Miami's sinking skyscrapers? It was not just failed waterproofing or variable limestone or an inadequate reserve statute. Those are symptoms. The engineering failure was a philosophy, a belief embedded across decades of construction and legislation and condominium board votes that the laws of physics and geology could be treated the same way as an inconvenient line item on a budget, that the water table could be ignored because it had always been ignored, that the porous karst beneath the foundations would hold because it had always held, that the report on the desk was someone else's problem to solve and someone else's timeline to meet. Champlain Towers South stands not as an anomaly, but as the most visible proof of a pattern. The 98 people who died there did not die because of a storm or an earthquake or a failure that nobody could have foreseen. They died at the end of a chain of decisions about foundations, about reserves, about warnings received and filed and never acted upon. That was as well documented as it was ignored. The 35 buildings still standing in Miami, still occupied, still receiving reports that describe the same deterioration the 2018 Morabito survey described, are not mysteries. They are a consequence. The only question is whether their story ends with a repair bill, a demolition order, or something worse. In Miami, the most dangerous foundation is not the limestone beneath the building. It is the assumption that because a structure is standing today, it will be standing tomorrow.